Bass Case 2, Episode 1, Pulling It Off the Record, Part 1. This is Season 2, Episode 1. A demarcation of 2 years of creating these podcast episodes to help my students and the bass players around the world that are much like my students. Looking for answers, seeking guidance on being a bass player. This is a good time to be a bass player. There are more resources than ever. YouTube videos, podcasts, virtual lessons, online schools. And I've done them all to some extent. YouTube videos, I make them and I've watched them to help me with techniques or learn lines, etc. And there's some good ones out there. Podcasts, I make them and I listen to a few of them. I've taken some virtual lessons. I enrolled at one point in an online school for bass players. It was good while it lasted. But in keeping the train of thought of this being a good time to be a bass player, I want to harken back to a time when the above listed resources didn't exist. No YouTube, no internet, no laptops, no phones, no iPads. I took some lessons at a music store and with a couple bass players at their houses. That was their studio. I bought books with built-in recordings. It was usually cassettes and then later CDs. And I read articles for bass players where I could find them, and they were pretty scarce. There wasn't a lot out there at that time for bass players. But the biggest one out there is still the biggest one out there, meaning it's the most useful resource out there, and that's the recording. When I was first starting to do this, you wanted to learn the lines of a song. You pulled it off the recording. You just listened to it and you found it. You figured it out. Maybe you had your teacher help you with it. And keeping in mind, I started with cassettes. That was the technology when I was beginning this. In my father's day, he was a guitarist, and it was the LP and the record player. But it worked. Thousands of players learned how to play like that. And you learned it correctly, or as correctly as your ears allowed you to. Meaning your ears may not have been developed enough to understand what you were hearing, or you couldn't hear the bass in the mix or parts of the bass in the mix. Either way, it was a challenge, but so good. I still do it. You must. It's the number one ear training for musicians. You pull the melody, the bass line, or the solo off the recording. You know, with those cassettes, I had to hit rewind a number of times. My cassette deck or slash stereo, whatever I was working with, had a counter. You know, it was totally analog. And I'd land on the number and hear the line again and again and again and again and again, and so on and so forth. But you really learn the line that way. It was embedded into your system. All that repetition, all that trial and error of learning the line and hearing it and say, wait a second, there's a note not right here, a rhythm not right. And you learned it in real time. And it was the technology available at the time. You couldn't complain because that was the way the other players were doing it. Nobody had anything else. They were using cassettes, and then when CDs came along, it made it somewhat easier. But it was still moving it back. And then a digital tool came along in the late 90s. The brand I bought was called Chop Shop. It was a device. It wasn't much bigger than a phone, and it only did one thing. It sampled up to 34 seconds of audio. And you plugged it into the stereo, and you sampled what you wanted, you know, no longer than 34 seconds, right? I didn't need that much. Then you plugged your bass into it in your headphones, and it would repeat that line on its own that you had sampled. Now, that was very handy. And then again and again and again and again. And it made everything much faster. And you could slow it down, too. You could slow it down to half speed and what I believe 3/4 speed and maybe 1/4 speed. And my whole world blew up when I had that device. I remember at the time I was transcribing the saxophonist Jimmy Heath and trumpeter Clifford Brown solos for improv class, and it was so helpful to get those lines slowed down. And I used it until newer technology came along. Now, I'm not going to advertise this newer technology, but there are apps that allow you to download the entire track and slice the portion that you want and slow it down anywhere from 1 to 99%. And I work even faster now. But it's built into YouTube. You can slow YouTube down like you know. You can slow it down in increments of 25%, 75% slower, or slow it down to half speed or 25%. You don't even have to buy the recording any longer, right? Like a friend of mine once said, there's no excuses left. You got to pull it off the record. There's no excuse not to do that. Do not skip this process. Like I said, you learn it better, you train your ears. Additionally, everything out there is not in notation or tab. You're going to have to learn this and do this at some point. So have your ears trained already, and you'll be able to do it faster when that keys player at church or in rehearsal plays a line on the left hand of his keyboard, and you pick it up like that. Start in small chunks. You don't necessarily have to transcribe a bass line or solo. It could be a trumpet line, a vocal line, and play it on your bass. Do something that's not too daunting. It's very helpful. Maybe you don't want to use a recording. Maybe singing a line, you know. I was reading about, can't think of the bass player. He said that was the thing. He'd sing lines. He'd sing melodies and then find them on the bass. That's really good for you too. It's the same. It's basically the same process. You're training your ears to do this. Now, this is part 1. In part 2, I'll give you some steps in the process that'll make it easier. If you have questions, email me at phil@basscase.co. I'll talk to you soon.